Have you ever found yourself watching a Formula 1 race, or any race for that matter, and found yourself thinking, "Oh my god, this is so boring"? Yeah, right back at you there. Many a times, we found ourselves trying our damnedest to stay conscious, while the best drivers in the world, in the most expensive and most advanced cars drive around for a couple of hours, and nothing happens. At that point, you start wondering, is it the regulations? Is it a gulf in quality of car and driver? Or is it the racetrack that they're on right now? Of course, more often than not, it isn't the track's fault, but that sort of inquisitive thinking does lead you down a rabbit hole. What is the worst track that Formula 1 has ever raced on? And with how much we tend to whinge about the new tracks that make it onto the calendar, we've got to ask, how bad are they really when you compare them to all the ones that have come before? Well, in this video, I'm set to right the wrongs of the initial one that I made on this, and so here are the worst Formula 1 tracks of all time. For real this time. Okay, so first up, some dishonorable mentions. Let's go for the jugular here. Miami. No, this isn't recency bias. As an event, it does look pretty cool, even if it is a bit of a facade with the cardboard water, sponge cake racing, and $3 million tickets. But the track itself has quite a few problems, and heading into its third event there, not that many people are hyped about it. It was Jacarepaguá in Rio de Janeiro that was used in the 1980s. Yeah, sure, it did have a great atmosphere thanks to the awesome fans of Brazil, but you would get just as good an atmosphere at Interlagos. In fact, probably even better. When it came to the track itself, oh boy. It was flatter than a pancake and was largely a collection of sweepers that, combined with the heat, did their utmost to disable the drivers before they had a chance to finish the race. The street circuit of Valencia in the late 2000s and early 2010s was about as bland as racetracks got. Think of it as the Jai Courtney of racetracks. Long Beach may be a... No, we are not putting Long Beach on this list. Well, no, we are going to put it on this list, because the 1983 layout was an eyesore that even Formula E diehards would not dare touch with a 10-foot pole. That, combined with the huge bumps that broke cars and drivers, meant that this was a vile way for Formula 1 to leave California. There was Okayama in Japan, pretty decent for modern-day domestic racing. Not so much for 1990s Formula 1, where the cars were barely able to get out of second gear. The track was also a million miles away from running water or electricity, which meant that transporting large crowds of people in and out of the grounds on roads barely wide enough for yaks isn't exactly ideal. And finally, there's Bahrain, which in 2024, under lights, is pretty damn good. The 2010 iteration, however, was not. A Mickey Mouse section in the first sector that did nothing other than destroy the flow of racing and annoyed anybody blessed with the gift of sight. But hold up. Why is it in the thumbnail of this video if it ain't actually on the ranked list? Is it to throw you all off? Well, there is an element to that, but what I am trying to impress here is that despite how rancid this layout was, and how popularly bad it is amongst F1 folklore, there has been worse in Formula 1. A lot worse. Back in the early 1970s, the Spa-Francorchamps circuit was the venue for the Belgian Grand Prix. It was a great driver's track, but the noticeable lack of safety was becoming too much for a Grand Prix circus that was becoming increasingly safety conscious. Formula 1 drivers liked the idea of being able to go back to their families in one piece. Soft. The solution to this dilemma? Create a brand new track for the Belgian race, just outside of Brussels. It was all very nice and grand. Problem was, no one liked it. It was designed with safety in mind, yeah, all good intentions, but some dared to say that it was perhaps too safe. Compared to the hills of Stavelot, this track had very little elevation, little in the way of technical challenges, and thanks to the enormous runoffs that were made to keep everyone safe, spectators were never quite close enough to the track to be able to properly see what the hell was going on. Although, this being the Dark Ages, you were never considered close enough to the track until you were on the verge of becoming roadkill. It was first used in 1972, where it garnered a sum total of no praise, and by the time Formula 1 came back a couple of years later, the circuit was in dire financial trouble, eventually falling into bankruptcy in 1974. Just a couple months after this happened, the Grand Prix circus headed to France. Not a new country to them, but the circuit they'd be on was new. The Circuit de Jean-Pierre. It was built with the ambition of a passionate man who gleefully glossed over the fact that he had no money to build said racetrack. Yet, however he managed to do it, in 1974, there they were, all turned up for the French Grand Prix at what, for Formula 1 cars, was, shall we say, a less than ideal track. There was only one heavy braking zone on the circuit, with the rest of the track interspliced with long sweepers that made overtaking kind of impossible to anyone that did not have a death wish. And because the track was so short in length, this was the only track in Formula 1's history for 70 years that had lap times that went under a minute. Not so much of a bad thing if the racing was good, like it was in Sakhir 2020, but here, it wasn't. However, it does have a happy ending. After a couple of years away, they extended the track, and it would end up hosting one of the greatest battles in the history of Formula One. In that time, however, the French Grand Prix would be hosted at Circuit Paul Ricard. This track ain't really that popular, but it doesn't belong in this list either. There was something else from this country though, that did. A few years before that first race at Dijon, Formula One turned up to Le Mans, one of the best racing series in the world, at one of the best racetracks in the world. How could you go wrong? Well, as it would turn out, somehow, they did. The prospect of a race here was relatively tantalizing. That big, huge Mulsanne straight would have provided the ultimate drafting battle, but they weren't using that. In fact, a lot of the track that they used for the 24-hour race was going to be bypassed. They would be using the Bugatti circuit that wiggled around in a slow, clumsy format that bored the drivers about as much as it did the spectators. The drivers really didn't like it and mulled over the thought of staging a coup d'etat and just running on the big track anyway. Them being in France, such actions would have been considered a mark of respect. Were there any positives to take from this race? Well, the track didn't break up, at least. Sounds kind of silly for that to sound like a positive. Is that, or has that, really been an issue with Formula One tracks at all? Well, yeah. You want an example? Alright, let's go to 1984. By this time, Bernie Ecclestone was doing everything in his power to make Formula One a major sport in America. Trouble was, only 300 people would turn up, and all the circuits were rubbish, especially in the 80s. Exhibit A, Dallas Fair Park. Designed using the walking path of a drunk in a blindfold, this track played host to the 9th round of the 84 season, a year that saw the debut of Ayrton Senna and some of the ugliest racing cars ever dreamed up by a sentient form of life. But despite the impending doom of slander I'm about to bestow upon this track, it did at least possess a bit of character. Some drivers did like it, and there have been more poorly designed tracks, I will give it that. Some could argue that there were one too many chicanes that did nothing to add to the racing, and that there weren't that many runoffs, meaning that any mistake on this track was going to leave you with broken ribs if you were really lucky. But as far as problems go, that was nothing. Right from the get-go, the track began to fall apart to an extreme degree. Repairs took place multiple times over the course of the weekend and were still taking place 30 minutes before the race was due to start, which was pushed forward 3 hours due to the heat. It was so bad that the drivers attempted to arrange a boycott, with the exception of Keke Rosberg, who was under the illusion that if tobacco wasn't going to kill him, then nothing would. Alas, when the race got underway, multiple cars spared off into the wall and were out of the race. Those that managed to survive all this were rewarded with dehydration. Buckets of cold water and ice were thrown onto the drivers in the pit stops, but even this barely did much. When Nigel Mansell pushed his car to the line, he collapsed, the heat and endurance having taken its toll. When the Grand Prix fraternity left the track, they would never return. Which, if we take away the various problems with it, was a slight shame, because at least this track didn't have, say, a massive ramp on it that could lead you to a grisly end if you got it wrong. In Berlin, however, track designers there thought of that as more of a unique selling point. The idea that Formula One drivers just drive in circles is ludicrous nowadays, but in 1959, that wasn't far from the truth. Avis, or AVUS, was a circuit with 2 huge-ass straights, 2 relatively sharp corners, and that's about it. It is kind of interesting, given some of the history and the influence that it had on road networks throughout Europe, apparently, but as a racetrack, yikes. The 2 long straights served as nothing more than a drafting battle for anyone even remotely close to you. Not so bad at a place like Le Mans, where it's merely part of the racetrack, but when it's all of the racetrack, then you would have to hit the brakes very, very hard, for on either end, there were 2 corners, just yearning to send you to the afterlife. The second corner was particularly nasty, a massively steep banked curve that was angled at 43 degrees and made entirely out of brick. And because there was no barrier on the outskirts, and effectively made this one gigantic ramp, it was given the lovely nickname of the Wall of Death. This became a problem when Formula One rocked up for its first ever race in 1959. The tires, which back back then were cannibalized from prams, were being eviscerated on the surface, and thus the Grand Prix would be split up into 2 heats. The only time that's ever happened. To pour salt onto the wounds for this weekend, the immensely talented French driver Jean-Pierre was killed when his car went up and over the banking. And for Avis, Formula One would cease racing here on this day in 1959. 50 years later, the next track on this list will get its first ever Grand Prix. Right from the very moment that the first spade went into the ground here, the Yas Marina Circuit was universally loathed. It was built at a time where Bernie Ecclestone had ditched any ethics he may have had and went straight for whoever had the largest checkbook in hand. The venue was pretty spectacular, with the floodlights, the underground pit exit, the amphitheater grandstands, and the marina that wasn't fake. Wink wink, nudge nudge, Miami. And as a testing venue, it's not half bad. But after having lost the likes of Imola and the A1 ring from the calendar, to come here was a bit of a downer. At least the drivers were diplomatically complimentary about it, with the exception of Kimi Räikkönen, who flat out said that most of the track was shit. Never change, Kimi. It did lack soul, and the third sector was unacceptably bad. The racing was generally appalling, and it says a lot when the Lord of the Eyebrows couldn't pass the Renault of Vitaly Petrov for an entire race. Things needed to change, and eventually they did for the better. But this track was proof that, despite having some really good designs, Herman Tilke had the ability to make some truly dreadful racetracks. However, Abu Dhabi was never his worst one. Oh boy, here we go. The Sochi Autodrome. I hate this track. I really do. I hate this track. I hate everything that it stands for. I hate everything that it embodies. I hate the fact that it is completely without soul. I hate the fact that it's a concrete canyon that churns out some generally rancid racing. I hate the lifeless paddock area that resonates an LSD trip in a black and white film. I hate the fact that there were much better racetracks in this country, yet they still went to this dead-on-arrival cesspool that couldn't draw praise if you gave it a sheet of paper and a Sharpie. In fact, you really want to know what I think of this track? Just check this out. Okay then, so if it's really that bad, why isn't it at the top? Well, despite my resentment toward the track, it's not entirely shared by people who have driven it, and a few F1 fans out there do like it, some reckoning it to be a fun track to drive, and that it does present a few challenges in a few different sections of racetrack, and when water is added to the track, it can throw up a half-decent race. Ultimately, it did at least function as a racetrack. Barely, even if it doesn't have some flashy tunnels like Abu Dhabi does. Then again, just because a racetrack has tunnels on it doesn't guarantee that it's going to be good. The next track had 2, and it was unspeakably terrible. In the early 1980s, the US motor industry was starting to run into trouble, and now the big 3 manufacturers stationed in the city of Detroit were starting to shake like a dog shitting peach seeds. So how do we stick it to the Europeans and show them who's boss? By inviting them over for a race around the streets of Detroit. The track was built during the first race in 1982. No, you heard that right. They were literally still building the track by the time the first practice should have kicked off. Then at 4 p.m. on Friday, the drivers were let out for a grand total of 4.5 minutes practice, at least when you factor in all of the stoppages. The layout of the circuit, the bumps, dirt and grime meant there were more red flags than a Soviet parade. Improvements to the track continued throughout the weekend. Then when the race started on Sunday, the problems really started. The bumpy nature of the track shook the cars to pieces, and it only got worse over the next few years, with the organizers blatantly refusing to rectify the broken asphalt. It was so bad that even Ayrton Senna, the grand master of this racetrack, said that driving on the circuit was like racing in a monsoon. Eventually, Formula One had enough and left Detroit to smolder, a dung heap that proved to be one of the worst Formula One tracks ever made. But amazingly, it wasn't even the worst to come out of America. In 2023, Formula One returned to the city of Las Vegas. It was a tantalizing prospect for all those gullible enough who think they could beat the house. But for everyone who knows their history, there was some amount of skepticism because the last time that Formula One raced here in Sin City, well, it didn't go so well. Back in 1981, the Caesars Palace Grand Prix would cough and splutter its way into life. It was called the Caesars Palace Grand Prix for the novel reasoning that it was run in their actual parking lot, and as such, there was no elevation to speak of. It looped in and around of itself, with the layout putting a massive strain on the drivers' necks. There were a few overtaking opportunities, but the sand blown onto the track meant that you would be asking for trouble if you tried anything funny. Only 7 people turned up for the race, and they were greeted with no shading at any point around the circuit. And by the time the 1982 race ended, no one really wanted to come back here. Their wish was granted, and now any trace of that track is gone. Buried beneath the mirage, none of the pain and misery that this track inflicted on people will ever bear sunlight again. But even all of this still doesn't make it the worst Formula 1 track of all time. So now it's come down to this. Number 1. The worst ever. The track in question can be found in Austria, located just outside of Spielberg. Nothing about this track ever worked, and now it's time to recognize it as the worst Formula 1 track of all time. What, you really thought I was talking about this one? What, the Red Bull Ring? Get out of here. This doesn't belong anywhere near this list. No. The track I'm talking about is the very reason why this one was built in the first place. It was located right across the street from the Red Bull Ring at the local Air Force Base, the Air Force Base of Zeltwig. In the early 1960s, the Austrians were quite keen to put themselves on the Grand Prix map. They ran a non-championship race at the circuit in 1963 and was set to have a full-on championship race for the year 1964. Now, the track layout was, to put it nicely, simple. Because the track was laid out on an Air Force base, and because they could only really use the taxiways and the sole runway, the track configuration had the design aspects of an Etch-a-Sketch. The only track layout simpler than this was AVUS, but at least that had the Wall of Death. And because the only barriers to speak of were hay bales, this track ended up having less features than a cave. But, as we've seen from a few of the other tracks on this list, things only went downhill from there. The timing tower didn't work properly for qualifying, thus the starting grid was determined by vibes. The track began to break up very badly from the word go, and the corrugations meant that driving on the surface was like sharing a waterbed with a baboon that's been drenched in itching powder. Even before the actual race on Sunday, cars were breaking apart left, right and center thanks to this. And because so many cars were knocked out, the race was a bit of a bore, the only real entertainment being a mid-race barbecue courtesy of Phil Hill on lap 58. When Lorenzo Bandini crossed the line to win his first ever race in Formula 1, he cried, not tears of joy, but tears of elation. Elation that he would never have to drive this god-awful track again. For Zeltwig wasn't just bad at one thing, it was bad at everything. It possessed every terrible trait that all the other tracks had and balled it up into this Frankenstein monster of a racetrack that should serve as a warning from history and will forever be the worst Formula 1 track of all time. I guess the only thing I could say now to close out this video is, why am I wrong this time?